Chartered accountant and political analyst Khaya Sithole joins us now on the line to talk about this. Khaya, is it a case of disappointment with the expectations that were created? ANC promised to create some 1.3 million jobs over the next 5 years at the beginning of electioneering season in January, or is it its inability to weather the storms from the internal and external shocks?
Good evening, and good evening to the viewers. And I suspect it really is a combination of the grave disappointment that the citizens of the country are now experiencing with the government, because again, the key issue here is that the one understanding that we all had was that the unemployment crisis was central to every party's manifesto. It was central to every political party's understanding of what the key issues are in the country. And of course, the party that did win the mandate is the one that then has the responsibility to show us what the roadmap is towards fixing the unemployment crisis. And I think if you then even look at how way back at the beginning of 2018, the new administration essentially came in with the replacement of the president, there was always this promise that we are dealing with the crisis. But unfortunately, the numbers do not seem to indicate how the crisis is being dealt with. And I think that type of anxiety is really becoming a much bigger problem. That prevailing gap between, expectations and outcomes is becoming a big issue for the government. And of course, we do get the impression that they get as surprised as we are when the results come out, when the statistics come out, because they're not fully in charge of the process. They do not have a control on all the levers relating to the economy. So of course, it is difficult for them, even on a day like this, to come out and say, oh, by the way, we expected those numbers because of these particular issues that have or haven't worked out.
So
and you don't want the government to sound surprised like we do.
Let me jump in there and ask this question. Why be surprised? Is it wise politically for any government, for any political party to quote numbers? If, for instance, you say in 2015, we're going to give you 6 million jobs. In 2020, you say we'll have 5 million jobs by then. But then you change in 2018 and say we'll have 1 million jobs by 2021. Should you be committing to numbers at all?
Not at all. And I think it's always a big risk when you commit to a number, any number in particular, because what that then does is that it gives people a tangible basis for saying you haven't done your job. And whether you say 275,000 jobs or 1 million jobs, as soon as you fail to exhibit how that has been achieved, then there is this creeping trust deficit that emerges between whatever numbers you might say later on, even if they're more credible than what you've achieved before. People just stop believing that. And I think also it's quite important for us to remember that when you talk about unemployment numbers, it could be possible that indeed 1 million jobs were created. But if the number of people that enter the job market is much higher than that 1 million, then it means actually then the rate at which we're looking, which is the unemployment statistic, is itself regressing. So I think if the government could come out with the defense that says, well, in spite of the fact that the unemployment rate is up, we did actually create that number of jobs, then people will at least start trusting it. But in this instance, they can't tell us how many jobs were created. And in that regard, it really means that whatever numbers they say in the future, people are going to be remarkably skeptical about them.
So let's look at what is then within the purview of the governing party. So if you can't commit to the numbers, what about the policy directives that you proffer? I mean, looking at some of what the ANC government had promised to do, they'd said in their election manifesto that they're going to transform the economy, breaking down monopolies, ensuring that SMMEs don't get left out in the growth part. So have they been able to do that? Is there evidence of even an attempt to do that?
That is the big problem, because if you don't have to deal with the numbers, all you have to do is give people the framework to say, look, these are the things that we are going to put into place. And our belief is that if these things do go into place and they work out the way we expect them to work out, then the net consequence of that will be greater jobs that are created in the economy. What has been the problem in South Africa historically is that in one moment you might have that type of framework, or what sounds like a framework, being articulated only for the operational or for the actual implementation of it to go completely at odds with what was promised to us, what was promised to the citizens. And it is when you see this massive misdirection or misalignment between the policy articulation and the policy implementations, where suddenly everything gets paralyzed. So I do think that instead of giving particular numbers, we need to be able to say that we've identified where the biggest levers of of possible employment, and these are the resources that we're putting towards those particular sectors in order to galvanize the employment momentum. And it will not necessarily be every sector of the economy, but you must be able to identify 2, 3, or 4 sectors that you feel, based on the resources that you have, based on the prevailing economic conditions, based on the prevailing global conditions, those sectors represent your best chance of actually creating jobs. And I think that's probably what's missing the conversation.
So part of the plan has been to promote developmental growth through radical land reform and a plan to broaden ownership of the economy. How feasible is this under the current political climate, with bars being traded one way or the other of one person or party entity that's more radical than the other, and also the issue of the influence of established capital? Transformation, diversity in financial sector, for instance, that's been put on the cards. Have those been clear in the strategies that have been in place in this new administration?
I think when we talk about the prevailing political climate, we also have to talk about the prevailing economic architecture, in that in some instances, you as a president, for example, may have a wish list of saying that, look, if I had absolutely no hindrances, if I had absolutely no limitations, these are the things that I would do overnight, and this is what I expect those things to do. But unfortunately, when you're in a position of being in government, you have to consider all those external factors and say, based on the prevailing economic circumstances to which I've decided to subscribe, then this is what I'm able to do. I think one particular example we saw a couple of years ago when the chicken farms are being shut down in KZN in particular, and the question was, well, why don't you just increase the tariffs on imports? And of course, to do that would then invite additional consequences in other sectors. And I think government occasionally struggle to articulate that to people. So people within a sector simply say that the government is not doing enough to protect us, but the government has to look at the overall holistic picture. And if it turns out that within that overall holistic picture, the government finds itself paralyzed and unable to do things that matter most to the people of the country that it governs, well, of course, it must then look into that overall holistic architecture and find out what needs to be changed and what needs to be done differently. But to simply then say the prevailing economic circumstances make it impractical or impossible for us to break away and do the things that we want to be able to do to get those right outcomes, that is a license to being kicked out of government, unfortunately.
So there are those who've been saying that we at least must be patient. It'll take some time to fix even the political economy. So we're speaking about diversity in the financial sector. We've seen new entrants into the market. Does that mean that the jobs are somewhere down the line? Data as full government has committed itself to that. Is that something that we'll see also pay off in the mid to long term?
I think the time lag is always inevitable, and I think when you do have that type of time lag, again, it becomes even more important for you to keep communicating to people. So, for example, if people really believed what you said in a manifesto on the 8th of January, your responsibility, especially on a day like this, when the data indicates that things are not working out well, is to be able to then say, oh, by the way, in spite of what you've heard today, this is actually what we've already put into place, but unfortunately the numbers or the effects or the consequences of what we've just put into place is going to take this particular time frame in order for it to translate to a tangible impact on the numbers that we're reporting. I don't think people are going to begrudge a government that is more honest in explaining the time lags that are inherent in data reporting, but I think in this instance, when then there's a vacuum in the conversation, people become even more anxious and people just simply think, well, actually, perhaps this is not the administration that knows how to deal with these particular problems. But then we did work for them, so we have to be able to support them and find out what assistance they need in order to get things moving.
Thank you very much. Chartered accountant and political analyst Khaya Sithole. Stephen?